Das ist mal gar nichts, ne? Das ist mal ein Schuss in den Ofen. Ja Leute, wir können jetzt als letztes Video nochmal bei den Omega-Uhren vorbeischauen. Das Video ist ein bisschen länger, habe mir vorgeschlagen und ich sehe schon auf dem Titelbild, zwei von den Modellen habe ich selber auch. Einmal die Tintin in der Mitte und links außen die Alaska auch. Lass mal reingucken, was denn hier los ist. Ich kenne den Channel gar nicht.
Do you enjoy the Omega Speedmaster? This is probably the video for you, if you enjoy the modern references. The thinking was to address the greatest modern Omega Speedmasters that you can currently buy on the market. And as we know, there are many of them. So many that if I had to do a full video on every single one, it would probably be 15 minutes long. So the thinking was to condense some of the pieces that have really caught my eye over time and discuss all of their designs individually, look at the aesthetics that make them unique, and possibly find a handful that really do stand out the most. Again,
was viele nicht wissen, zum Beispiel hier, das hier sind einzelne Onyx-Plättchen, also Onyx-Steine. Auf der Rückseite gibt es auch eine Menge zu sehen.
And this must be emphasized that we are going to be looking at modern pieces, nothing vintage, maybe some that are vintage inspired, but nothing classical.
Ich glaube, das ist eine neue in Platin, kann das sein? Die ist in Platin mit Meteorit, glaube ich.
We probably won't be talking about movements very much, but instead focusing on the aesthetic details, the uses of materials, and the elements that make these models stand out from the crowd. So to begin, let's just discuss the basics of the Speedmaster. Why is it so popular? It's become a real cult classic. It's incredible, really. And we can say that Omega has taken...
Man kann halt bei Omega so viel mitmachen, mit den Bändern und so weiter. Die Uhr ist einfach zeitlos, jeder kann die haben und so. Jeder kann die einfach bis zum Lebensende tragen. Ich feiere die Omega, ja, ich feiere sie einfach.
Serious liberties with creating millions of limited editions, recreations, anniversary models, as you will be seeing. But the watch on its own has done some
auch interessant, ne? Omega macht so viele Limitierungen und trotzdem sind die wertstabil, Hublot nicht.
Incredible things. It has one of the best histories that a watch could ever have. And just speaking practically about the model itself, it's so versatile. Let's just begin by looking at the Speedmaster Professional Hesselite Crystal. This is the model that everyone gravitates towards, for many good reasons. What does it do so well? Design-wise, the dial architecture. This watch is noted to be one of the greatest pieces of industrial design in the watch industry. The use of line weights, the understanding of where the elements need to be placed, and just...
Ja, die Uhr hat eine unglaubliche Symmetrie, muss man sagen. Zeitlos mit der schwarzen Lünette. Von diesem Modell haben wir auch einige zurzeit auf der Webseite. Die sind auch in diesem Jahr relativ teuer geworden, von 4.200 € so auf 4.700 €. Schönes Modell.
How easy the dial can be read at a glance. It very much looks like a modern instrument, even today. They are expensive, yes, but they are relatively affordable. This professional model in particular is manually wound. It has an acrylic crystal. These elements allow you to appreciate the older approaches taken. The way it has a lot of presence on the wrist, but at the same time is so monotone and neutral, allows for it to be used in any environment, any occasion. It allows great opportunity for strap integration. Use of
das stimmt, was er sagt. Man kann hier die Uhr mit jedem farbigen Band, mit NATO-Strap, mit allem tragen. Das ist schon richtig.
Different colors, as we will see when we get into the video itself. Lots of people agree that it makes for such an excellent one watch, and it's hard to deny it. Not only does it have an incredible history, a series of great developments to its name, but it gives you the feeling of really wearing a mechanical watch, made by an excellent house, and it's all you really need at the end of the day. The next on the list is the Apollo 15 35th anniversary. It is quite a unique model that isn't discussed often.
Hä? Die habe ich noch gar nicht gesehen. Roségold. Ich habe gekauft jetzt 30-jähriges Jubiläum der Mondlandung, glaube ich. Ich weiß nicht, was ich gekauft habe. Irgendwas habe ich gekauft.
What it really manages to do is jazz up the dial and the pushes with a bit of a two-tone addition, using gold to help emphasize various elements. And this watch caught my attention because it does look a lot more dressier. It has a more formal presence around it. The gold aspects remind me so much of a Zenith Daytona, actually. So if you are someone who wants more emphasis on the subdials, still enjoys the overall professional aesthetic, but wants a model that offers a little bit more definition in various places, this is a great one to go for. The grey ceramic, known as the grey side of the moon. What makes this piece fascinating?
Coole Uhr, Grey Side of the Moon, aber ich stehe doch eher auf die klassische.
Well, it's not so much the same as the other pieces we've already seen. This is in fact a coaxial, meaning that it is automatic. But the use of grey ceramic, how it then blends with the bezel and the grey dial. The choice of situating a date complication at the 6 o'clock position makes it a practical everyday wearing piece, but at the same time a watch that doesn't attract much attention. Even the enthusiast would look at a watch like this and not necessarily consider it a Speedmaster at first. The material usage and how these colors work so well together is fascinating. It's a great combination, but is a departure from the professional that we know so well. 2 subdials instead of 3, an automatic movement, but this layout does formalize the watch a lot more. The Speedmaster Apollo 11th 35th anniversary model. This one has a more literal panda aesthetic to its dial and is one of the best for it. Such a clean and simple layout for someone who does enjoy the panda aesthetic.
Ich finde dann doch wieder Schwarzblatt besser.
In red, it does add the commemorative date. Now this model, though visually striking, does have a few drawbacks, like the plots that run around the outside of the dial. Because they aren't colorized and are instead stainless steel or silver, they're very difficult to...
Komisch, ne? Bei der Daytona feiert man die Panda und bei der jetzt nicht so sehr.
to see in low light. The hands too are very difficult to identify, and this does go against the real practicality of what made the Professional such an impressive watch. But what saves it is that you get really absorbed into the panda dial and the bezel. Maybe
Merkt euch mal bitte den Look jetzt und später, wenn die Alaska kommt. Bin ich mal gespannt, was ihr zu der Alaska Project sagt.
Format doesn't allow you to read the time as quickly as you would like, but the combination of parts is very captivating. A fan favorite, the first Omega in space. This model is a more literal translation of one of the first Speedmasters to ever leave the Earth. Banking on a more traditional styled case, this piece does feel to be such a great tribute to the original because it manages to present itself in such a way that it's not overbearing.
Yeah,
the proportions and scale of the watch is fantastic. The attempt to recreate many elements that people enjoyed so much about the originals, like the applied logo, the way the hands have been integrated, where the running seconds in its alpha-style format matches the hour and the minute hand, where the chronograph hand, 30-minute and 12-hour totalizers are all in white and match each other there. So it not only acts as a functional instrument, but also has a dress feel behind it as well, which would appeal to a lot of people. Because it is smaller in size and not the traditional 42mm, it also might make the wearing experience a lot easier. The only drawback, I believe, on this model is that it has a sapphire crystal and not a heterolite crystal. The Speedy Tuesday took many elements from past models and combined them together into a professional model that looks very attractive. It uses
das ist diese Speedy Tuesday, die hat halt einen sehr krassen Vintage-Look.
A reverse panda aesthetic with a very unique set of subdials. And this model was really made with
Alaska. Wir gucken uns gleich die Alaska.
Looking at its presence and the character that it has. It's one of the most desirable models because it really is not only functional but also very stylized. And for the vintage Omega enthusiasts, you notice the small cues that have been added into various places. The Apollo 15 40th anniversary, using the highlights of red, white and blue on the subdial and around the minute track. It is very patriotic but very lively as well. It's a Speedmaster Professional with a bit more excitement added to the mix. Does the use of these colors aid in readability? Not so much. More than anything else, it's a fun exercise, but allows for a great use of primary colors around the dial. And if you stare at the dial long enough, it's quite mesmerizing. Of all the colors used, the red seems quite overpowering, but it's another example of a professional model that manages to skirt under the radar. And only after looking at it twice would the enthusiast notice the smaller details. The Japan Racing Edition is one of the most sought after and collectible models in this line. Using a dial format very similar to the Mark II renditions of the professional models, a video to that will be linked in the corner of the screen. This format of a racing dial allows for the watch to be extremely legible, a lot more functional actually. You will notice when you see racing dials that the minute track has been emphasized in such a way, allowing for you to read the chronograph hand to the second a lot easier. But really what makes it so striking is the use of burgundy and orange. It's a very 70s inspired color palette, but it is so effective. This variant in particular is really a professional with an X factor, which is something that a lot of enthusiasts in this hobby go after. But what makes it so great is that it's not just a nuance that's been added in a few places. This combination really covers the entire dial and the handsets used. Great looking piece. Now the Racing Master Chronometer is the more modern take on this idea. Again using orange highlights and accents. A very well defined minute track that runs around the dial. But this one again, like the grey side of the moon, incorporates a coaxial movement. A date at the 6 o'clock position, 2 sets of subdials. But that amount of contrast and the colors chosen really makes it a fascinating piece to look at. You have to ask yourself why orange wasn't used more around the bezel. But the way the dial has been handled, with the use of colors, it definitely looks like a more modern watch. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's up to you. Tintin. Another very charming racing dial.
Die hat der Papa gekauft, ja. Sehr günstig sogar damals. Ich habe gekauft für 3.500 Euro. Deswegen auch hier oben, seht ihr, was auf, da, seht ihr da? Die Rakete? Die habe ich auch deswegen gekauft.
Model that is so basic in its execution, but streamlined because of it. Who knew that the use of red and white accents could make such a dynamic looking dial? Super. Immediately, the enthusiast would notice something different. And instead of making the dial really more functional,
da habe ich die Uhr, glaube ich, gerade geht für 10 oder so weg, ne? Sehr, sehr nice Uhr.
Like we would expect from a racing dial, this color set offers a lot more vibrance to the piece. And of course, a great amount of opportunity for the use of red straps. Anything with a red and white highlight. Like some of the models we've already seen, it doesn't go against the original professionals in the way it presents itself, but does offer a great highlight that makes this particular watch stand out from the crowd. The Skywalker X33, the real mission timer.
Skywalker? Okay.
And the story behind this, I mean, if you want a modern take on the original Speedmaster Professional, this watch is the best it gets. It's a model that is actively used by astronauts today. And what allows for it to be so functional is it doesn't only have an analog readout, but also an immense amount of digital readout. It's able to tell you over 3 different time zones. The mission timing aspect allows you to run the clock for hours on end. So in the case of you working in space, since you're not working to any particular time, but want to keep track on how long your mission is, it's a very practical instrument. The X33 is definitely the furthest departure away from the Speedmaster Professional line that we will be seeing. But the uniqueness of this model is that it was designed and tested in partnership with astronauts. You get a much more rounded feel of what an astronaut would be using this instrument for. And that is ultimately what the Speedmaster has always been about, ever since it first went to space. The Ck2998 Pulsometer. This model is simply gorgeous. Taking inspirations from, again, the same styling of the first Omega.
Die Lunette habe ich schon ein paar Mal gesehen bei Vintage-Modellen. Ist jetzt nicht so, die wäre jetzt nicht so meins, muss ich sagen.
In space, but looking at the panda aesthetic in a lot more detail. And the use of whites, blacks and creams on the dial makes it such an interesting pairing. Not only the space and the presence on the wrist, but the sheer contrast between the parts. You get to enjoy the various accents and the layers of depth to the dial itself. Now there are 2 variations of this model, the one not having a pulsation dial and instead using blue highlights, which is just as stunning. Now if you want a watch that does depart away from the professional, since this isn't technically a professional model in the line, but you also want something that is not only versatile but also stands out so well, these two modern Ck2998 recreations are some of the best that Omega has made. Not only do they look classical, but manage to also really give life to a new series of models. And let's not forget that these models don't sacrifice elements like legibility. These are functional watches that also allow you to read and use the chronograph very easily. Exceptional. By far one of my favorites in the line. The famous Snoopy. This watch made to commemorate Apollo 13, a very famous point in history where the Speedmaster was used to save the mission. And in the top right-hand corner of the dial, you see that it says,
what could you do in 14 seconds?
What could you do in 14 seconds? But it is very charming. If you are someone who loves Charlie Brown, someone who enjoys NASA's history, and really the story behind what made the Speedmaster so imperative during the mission, you should love this watch. Bear in mind that this model manages to attack the more polar white dial very well. The use of black accents on the dial makes it very easy to read. Nothing is highly polished, which does make a
Failure is not an option. Ist einfach so ein cooler Vibe irgendwie so, also gefällt mir die Uhr.
Great difference. There are a few Snoopy Award models, but the white dial is really the classic, and it's the one that collectors cannot get enough of. And arguably, it's the model that has the greatest story behind it. The Apollo 8, Dark Side of the Moon. Now there are a few variants in this line, but the Apollo 8 in particular is one that continually pulls me back, catches my attention, because it is one of the best exercises in understanding contrast, line weight and detail, but being able to make it such a legible watch at the same time. A black ceramic case, the dial itself being segmented and broken off, allowing you to see some of the movement components, as well as the dial having texture behind it. Then you have a fully integrated racing minute track, and an excellent use of yellow highlights that contrasts so well against the black. Also notice how much depth there is to the dial.
Also die Architektur von der Uhr ist eine 10 von 10. Also mich spricht jetzt nicht so an, aber ist krass gemacht.
In the series, it is a very visually engaging model. One that says you are wearing a Speedmaster, but it also feels to be more of a prototype. And of the models that we've seen already, this model really does look like something that is a bit more fun in the family. It's not trying to be as serious. It feels like the team who created this watch had a lot more creative license behind the scenes, and it really shows. And for that reason, it is one of the best executed modern pieces that we've seen. Because it is so legible, really plays on what made the Speedmaster Professional so important, but at the same time allows for the watch to be a lot more visually engaging in places. The 1957 reissue. Now yes, this like many others
die
is a
hatte ich auch schon mal
model,
da.
but it is a
Da hatte ich das Dreier-Set mal da, das ist diese Re-Edition Vintage.
Creation that has been done extremely well. Actually made a lot of history because these watches were recreated as one-to-one replicas.
Habe heute meine Gesellschaftsbestellung bekommen. Sag mal bitte, mit was du den Karton eingesprüht hast. Das ganze Treppenhaus riecht jetzt noch. Rumzocker? Tatsächlich ist das Air Tiger. Das ist der Prototyp vom Air Tiger. Also wenn du dich fragst, wie mein Parfum riechen wird, genauso. Das ist das Parfum.
Of the originals. What does this model have going for it? Well, it's a Speedmaster, but definitely doesn't look like your conventional Speedmaster. The presence of the watch on the wrist would be very understated, and most wouldn't recognize the model at first. Only the real enthusiasts would see the small details like a broad arrow hand, a steel bezel insert, the traditional end links and bracelet. Of course, this was done at a time when professional watches were in their infancy, so it definitely has a more dress-oriented aspect behind it. And really, this model back in the day was created for racing drivers. At the time when this watch was made, there was no thought that the Speedmaster would be eventually going to the moon. But as a tie to history, being able to say that you have an original Omega Speedmaster, it's a nice bragging right, and it is one of the outliers in this group. Now, the all-gold Speedmaster Apollo 11 is one of the best...
Glaub mir, das ist eine brutale Uhr. Ich hoffe, er zeigt die Rückseite. Was hier drin steckt in der Uhr ist...
recreations we've seen from the family. Very different to the pieces that we've seen already, but also manages to bring forward some of the design cues that we saw in the late 60s, early 70s and beyond. What the creators managed to do here with this approach is allow for the watch to not only be fully gold, but also extremely legible and actually functional, usable. Everything from the dial, bracelet to clasp, all accurate recreations. And as far as 50th anniversary pieces go, this one really makes a statement, especially the yellow gold variant with a burgundy bezel. It almost pushes
Auf der Rückseite ist der Mond und die Erde und so, ist ganz krass.
across the idea of a trophy Speedmaster Professional. And even in a fully yellow gold format, the watch could probably work in many different situations and look phenomenal. I doubt there would ever be a time when you would grow tired of a watch like this. The Ultraman. One of the more modern recreations that we've seen lately. And of course it's a...
Ultraman habe ich ganz am Anfang mal verkauft. Da gibt es ja so hier diese Schwarzleuchte mit dazu. Dann leuchtet hier dieser Kopf. Dadurch, dass ich jetzt keine Verbindung zu Ultraman als solches habe, habe ich jetzt nicht so die heftigste Verbindung.
Piece that pays tribute to a very specific Japanese domestic market model. But the way that this watch was handled and recreated was subtle. It is a very engaging watch, like we've already seen with the likes of the Tintin and the racing style variants.
Marc, gibt es eine blaue Speedmaster, wo Snoopy eine Rakete fliegt auf der Rückseite? Ja, die neue Speedmaster ist das. Die sollte jetzt auch ausgeliefert werden. Ich habe auch eine bestellt. Gucken, ob sie kommt.
This one is a lot more restrained. The beauty really comes from the orange highlights and how they have been used sparingly for a change. The idea of incorporating a black and orange NATO strap really accentuates the image. Then small touches like the Ultraman being printed on the running seconds dial. Like a few other models that we've already seen, this one does scream fun. It adds an X factor to the professional line. And again, it's a watch that a vintage enthusiast would really enjoy because it incorporates many cues that you don't see on your standard models. The color choice is just fascinating. Striking, but also very functional. Another newly released piece is the Apollo 11 50th anniversary that uses a tricolor combination of greys, blacks, golds. Now this is for the hardcore enthusiast, but the 50th anniversary is quite a special one. Notice the small details like, if I'm not mistaken, Buzz Aldrin leaving the module. At the 11 o'clock position you see the number 11, signifying Apollo 11. It's definitely not the most subtle or underrated that we've seen in the line so far, but it is a professional that has quite a hallmark. The feature that really captivates me is the use of the grey and the black, and how they work so well together on the dial. Black and gold, as always, is an exceptional combination of colours that complement each other, but don't necessarily draw a lot of attention. It is very muted in that way. The Alaska 2, tribute to a famous prototype, and the real development of the Alaska.
Die Uhr habe ich ewig gejagt. Das ist jetzt tatsächlich das Original, aber die zeigen gleich auch noch die ich habe.
The project. It has a very unique dial layout, but more specifically, an amazing outer case that allows for it to withstand all kinds of environmental changes and makes the watch look seriously overbuilt. The watch's dial itself has a few minor hallmarks that makes...
Die habe ich auch. Die habe ich sogar noch mit der ersten Rechnung. Also der Kunde, der die gekauft hat sie in Berlin damals im KDW gekauft. Niemand wollte die haben. Und das kann man halt auch wieder abmachen. Ne?
Makes it visually interesting, like the use of black, how it contrasts against the white dial. But it also does suffer from a few legibility issues. The applied batons themselves, being the same color as the dial, would make time telling quite difficult. Reading the chronograph and the subdials though, that's relatively easy. It's also one of the only professionals that comes with a white Velcro strap, which corresponds very nicely with the dial itself. And it really does communicate the idea of a prototype watch in the purest sense. And then we get to a modern recreation that many of us were asking for. We're talking about movements now, but the platinum-cased 321 recreation, the 321 caliber being made famous.
Heftige Uhr in Platin, Alter, eine Speedmaster in Platin.
By the Speedmaster professional, and all of that history is fascinating to study, but this is the wrong video for that. But the entire watch case being made of platinum, with meteorite for the subdials, and an open case back that allows you to appreciate the movement itself. This is another model that is aimed at collectors and real enthusiasts. But even still, with the use of meteorite on the subdials, which is very interesting, since this is a space-going watch, the aesthetic is still there, and now you're dealing with one of the best precious metals, and arguably one of the best chronograph movements ever made. And then finally, if you really want a recreation of a 321 in a stainless steel case, the new Ed White has been spoken about a lot. A very faithful recreation that came after the first Omega in space and the 1957 reissue that we've already seen. As far as Speedmasters go, this is really the all-encompassing model. It shows the real transition and step from a racing chronograph to a chronograph that went to space. And it is a perfect example. Again, you're dealing with a watch that has a great amount of presence on the wrist, not too much, not too little. It's definitely not as brash as the later professional models with the wider 42mm cases. But the dial, the tachymeter bezel, still uses all the same hallmarks that we are used to seeing. Now returning full circle to the Hesalite model we spoke about in the beginning, we've been able to see that in this small chapter of discussing about 20 variations, that the Speedmaster line really is the apple of Omega's eye, and they are so proud of it, as many watch enthusiasts should be. The line is very distinct. The watches themselves are famous. And hopefully you've been able to see that with the variety of pieces that are on offer, there is a lot of opportunity for you to choose what exactly speaks to you the most about the Speedmaster. I, for one, am someone who looks at the nuances and likes to find models that aren't necessarily the most favorable. In this collection of pieces that we've seen, the Ck2998 models are my favorites. They are very different.
Ja, muss ich sagen, echt ein cooles Video. Hat man einen guten Überblick bekommen über die verschiedenen Modelle.